Good evening. My name is Krista Akampora, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you to Hunter College and the Roosevelt House. This is a treasure for the college, and I am deeply grateful for being able to use the venue and for greeting you here. Our program tonight is part of a series of programs, and I see a lot of familiar faces in the crowd, so it's nice to see you again. This is the third in a series of 4 public events that are sponsored by the National Endowment for the Humanities as part of a program that we've titled The Experience of War, Moral Transformation, Injury, and Repair. And it's part of an umbrella of programs created by the NEH to explore war and its aftermath, promote discussion of the experience of military service, and support returning veterans and their families. The structure of Hunter's program as part of this funding stream is to have a theme each month, and we have a public event that's keyed around that theme. And leading up to the public event, we have small discussion groups of key sources in the humanities and as well as contemporary interpreters. And then we invite our participants to join us for a public event where we meet some of the authors in the series. So next month's events begin next week. And our big public event is just 1 week away. The theme for May is Moral Transformation in War. And our speakers include neuroscientist and philosopher Jesse Prince and clinical psychologist Dr. Brett Litzt. They will share the podium and discussion space with some veteran writers who have participated in our program. So I think it's going to be a rich program, some very interesting ideas, and some excellent writing. So please sign up tonight. You can sign up upstairs at the reception. You should have, by virtue of signing up for tonight, you should have earned yourself an invitation for next week as well. You can click the link there, or you can get to it from our website, which is in your program. It really promises to be a fantastic event. And if you sign up for a small group discussion tonight, we will give you a book. So it's great all around. The theme for this month is Morality in Relief. And the organizing idea behind that title is that the experience of war can highlight and draw out important distinctive features of moral experience. And I was motivated to think about those ideas and questions that arise from them, and then ultimately respond to the call for proposals from the National Endowment for the Humanities after reading the prize-winning book of our featured speaker tonight, Phil Klei's Redeployment. So I really have to thank Phil, not only for attending tonight, but for planting the seed for the entire program. And I'm thrilled that joining him in conversation this evening is fellow graduate of Hunter College, veteran and accomplished author in her own right, Mariette Kalinowski. So now just a little bit about our 2 speakers, and then I'm going to disappear here. Phil Klei is a Marine Corps veteran of the Iraq War and the author of the short story collection Redeployment, which won the 2014 National Book Award for Fiction. The National Book Critics Circle John Leonard Award for Best Debut Work in Any Genre, the American Library Association's W.Y. Boyd Literary Award for Excellence in Military Fiction, the Chautauqua Prize, and the Warwick Prize for Writing. A graduate of Hunter College's MFA program, his writing has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, Newsweek, and the Brookings Institution's Brookings Essay Series. And just last week, Phil was named a Guggenheim Fellow. As coordinator for student veteran services at the New School, Mariette Kalinowski oversees the successful transition and VA funding of veterans and veterans' dependents education. She's a graduate of Hunter College, first as a BA in English and again as an MFA in fiction. Her opinion pieces have appeared in various venues, including the New York Times, and she is published in the anthology Fire and Forget Short Stories from the Long War. In addition to her professional work with veterans, she's working on her first novel. Kalinowski is a veteran of the U.S. Marine Corps with 2 tours in Iraq, and she helped to found the current Hunter College Student Veterans Club. Please join me in welcoming Phil and Mariette in conversation on the theme of Crossing the Divide, Homecoming as Collective Responsibility.
Good evening. Thanks for coming out, especially with the unpredictable weather. At the heart of this series has always been the idea of moral injury, and one of the recurring terms in the conversation has always been responsibility. The case of responsibility can center on who needs to be held responsible for what. Should Marines and soldiers be held responsible for violence against other people during war? Does that responsibility change if it's determined that the others were combatants or innocent? Who is responsible for sending the troops in the first place? Should they ultimately be held responsible for making that decision, or should it be the people who created the reason for that decision? And what about those who were left behind? Families, friends, those who didn't serve. Should they be considered accountable in some way, or are they just as innocent as the bystanders? Redeployment, Phil Klei's collection, attempts to answer these questions, but not in the traditional war epic with violence at the forefront. The majority of the scenes take place after or outside of violence. The clearest images of combat are brief, over in a flash, much like the memories that return to those veterans later in life. The collection instead focuses on the interaction between people. Combat and non-combat troops, veterans of the same unit, those with visible and invisible wounds, veteran and civilian. It is in these moments that one sometimes sees the strongest definition of moral injury. Tonight, our conversation is going to center on the idea of the veteran and the civilian, the complication and the attempt to reconcile relationships. And this is going to be sort of a free-flowing conversation, so we're just going to let things go where they will. Okay. Phil will actually begin with a reading from the opening story, Redeployment.
Yeah, so it's really great being on stage with you, Mariette. I've known Mariette a long time. Actually, I think this is my first copy of my book, and Mariette signed it somewhere. Yeah. There you are. Thank you, Krista, for putting this together. It's an incredible series. Thanks, everybody, for coming out, as Mariette said. You know, a lot of people tend not to even want to talk about war when the sun is shining. Yeah. So you must be a strange and wonderful crowd indeed. I thought I would read small snippets from the book and also maybe a little bit from the novel that I'm working on now at periods in this conversation. And I'll read a little bit from the first story to kick things off. And the first story is probably the most conventional war story in the book. It's about an infantryman, frontline combat soldier who served in the Second Battle of Fallujah. So, urban combat of the sort that most people think when they think about war. And this is the first weekend home, and he goes shopping with his wife. So here's an experience. Your wife takes you shopping in Wilmington. Last time you walked down a city street, your Marine on point went down the side of the road, checking ahead and scanning the roofs across from him. The Marine behind him checks the windows on the top levels of the buildings. The Marine behind him gets the windows a little lower, and so on down until your guys have the street level covered, and the Marine in back has the rear. In a city, there's a million places they can kill you from. It freaks you out at first, but you go through like you were trained, and it works. In Wilmington, you don't have a squad, you don't have a battle buddy, you don't even have a weapon. You startle 10 times checking for it, and it's not there. You're safe, so your alertness should be at white, but it's not. Instead, you're stuck in a American Eagle Outfitters. Your wife gives you some clothes to try on, and you walk into the tiny dressing room, you close the door, and you don't want to open it again. Outside, there's people walking around by the windows like it's no big deal. People have no idea where Fallujah is, where 3 members of your platoon died. People who've spent their whole lives at white. They'll never get even close to orange. You can't until the first time you're in a firefight or the first time an IED goes off that you missed, and you realize that everybody's life, everybody's, depends on you not fucking up. And you depend on them. Some guys go straight to red. They stay like that for a while, and then they crash, go down past white, down to whatever is lower than, I don't fucking care if I die. Most everybody else stays orange all the time. Here's what orange is. You don't see or hear like you used to. Your brain chemistry changes. You take in every piece of the environment, everything. I could spot a dime in the street 20 yards away. I had antenna out that stretched down the block. It's hard to even remember exactly what that felt like. I think you take in too much information to store, so you just forget. Free up brain space to take in everything about the next moment that might keep you alive. And then you forget that moment too and focus on the next, and the next, and the next for 7 months. So that's orange. And then you go shopping in Wilmington, unarmed, and you think you can get back down to white? It'll be a long fucking time before you get down to white.
Thank you. And that last part, the focus on you're not just returning to the consumer culture of America, but it's unarmed. I've had individuals tell me that they became, when they had to give up their weapon, the weapon that they've kept with them for 7 months to a year and a half, they have instead chosen to carry a pen, and they keep that pen with them, much in the same way that someone who is overseas keeps their weapon with them, and it becomes a placeholder for that item that is always at your side.
And you know, the thing for him is kind of his habits of being have changed, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's funny, a lot of people read that and they go, oh, he has PTSD. He doesn't have PTSD, right? I mean, some of the things in the hypervigilance are related to some of the symptoms of PTSD, but one of the things that he's dealing with or trying to kind of wrap his head around is he's developed these ways of existing in the world that make sense if you are an infantryman in the Second Battle of Fallujah. And then he's back home at a place where not only do they not make sense, but they're actually harmful. They make it more difficult for you to integrate, more difficult to just be a normal person with your wife, with your family. And yet, you don't really want to give them up entirely, because this is not you know, a war where people go and they finish the war, right? If you had told me in 2008 when I was coming back from Iraq that we would still be fighting these freaking wars now, I mean, I probably would have believed you, but I wouldn't have wanted to believe you. You know, this is a guy he's going to go back. He's going to go back, and he's going to go back. So it's not how does Odysseus, you know, who spent, you know, all this time in the Trojan War, come back to an Ithaca that he doesn't remember, where only his dog recognizes him. It's how this guy goes over, comes back, goes over, comes back, goes over, comes back, goes over, comes back. And what's the space? What's the mental space that you need to figure out to exist in where you can be a husband, where you can be a normal person, where you can go shopping and do the grown-up shit of daily life, but also be at a stage where you can, you know, get back to orange when you need to, because you are going to need to.
Well, the color codes, which were developed by Jeff Cooper, who was a World War II Marine,
Mhm.
and then went on to be a significant and an influential hunting instructor. He designed those in order to maintain cognitive awareness during high threats as a way of keeping the human part of the brain
Mhm.
active rather than resorting to the animal. And there are
By the way, I had no idea of this until you emailed me these color codes. The reason I talked about the color codes was a Marine explained them to me that way.
Mhm.
A guy who'd been in the Second Battle of Fallujah, a friend of mine, and he was just trying to explain. Actually, he said verbatim, I could spot a dime in the street 20 yards away.
Well, I actually saw I was taught the color code watching a video about a South African big game hunter tracking a lion. So it's kind of this hyper masculine, like, let's go take control of nature. So just the fact that you use the color coding system and the attempt to maintain the human aspect of combat, do you feel like when you have those definitions of human versus animal, does that make it easier to define what is good versus bad in war? And that might be a loaded question,
I
but
think that one of the reasons that was one of the opening the opening story of the book was I wanted that shift in perception and the way that that character has learned to live present in the reader's mind as they read other stories that ask you to think about units that are doing much different things with a lot more moral questions. I mean, there's not that's just kind of a description of what is happening to the way that this guy exists in the world. It's not about the kind of choices that he makes, and the choice that he makes towards the end of the story is about how he's going to deal with his dog that's dying. But I think when you're talking about war experience and how people sort of process it, there's what the experience was like, what it felt like, and then there's the kind of moral questions on top of that sort of trouble veterans, right? But that can't fully be understood unless you also sort of deal with kind of the experiential aspects of the thing and what kind of state people are in when they're making the choices that they're making. And I think one of the things that we often tend to do when we're talking about war is, Jonathan Shea would talk about this, where he worked with Vietnam veterans, and some of them had deep moral qualms about some of the things that they did. And I'm not talking necessarily war crimes. It could be in a combat situation against somebody who's firing at you, you kill them, right? And yet they would feel guilty about that, even though that's a fairly clear-cut case of justified killing, sort of in war. And he talked about how he would sometimes, he worked with a bunch of, a lot of times there were Catholic guys around Boston, and he would find that the sacrament of confession would be actually useful for these people, but he would have to refer them to very particular priests, because one of the things that would happen was they'd go to a priest and they would confess this thing that had been sort of festering and they'd been thinking about for decades sometimes, and the priest would go, "No, you're doing what your country asked you. There's no sin there," and they get furious, right? Who the fuck are you to take my sin away from me? And it was very interesting to me. I was looking into kind of the history of kind of Catholic. I'm Catholic myself, of Catholic responses to war, and in the medieval period, you can find these documents talking about what penances people should do for different actions, and there are penances for killing in war, even in just war. And it breaks it down with this kind of really kind of amazing, like, if you killed somebody in a just war, here's the penance that you have to do. If you killed somebody in a just war, but you were only fighting in the just war for money, it's the same as a homicide. If you're an archer and there's no way to know if you killed anybody or not, here's the penalty. If you maimed somebody, here's the penalty. And it sort of breaks it down. There's just something really kind of weird to our mind about that. Like, you're a soldier fighting for your country in a just war. You're doing what you're supposed. Why would you then demand a penance? And yet I think that it's actually this sort of kind of wisdom about it that we ask people. I mean, part of being a human being is being connected to things that are awful and having to make choices where there may not be any good choice, right? But that doesn't mean that people don't feel that even though they're taking the best of bad options, that it doesn't leave a kind of moral residue on their soul that they need to actually deal with and process in some way.
Thinking about Shay, he several months ago now, he was our opening guest for the series, and he defined moral injury as the betrayal of what's right, the betrayal by a superior, and a high-stakes environment such as combat. And there is a movement within the VA to also add the betrayal of self. I have in the past heard you speak of your own service, and you claim not to have PTSD.
Right, no, I don't.
Can you explain what you mean and how your personal definition either does or does not fit into the moral considerations or the formal, considerations?
Well,
of
I mean,
moral.
It's an injury, right? So it's an injury I don't have, right? I don't have PTSD. I don't have an amputated leg either. It's sort of a set of symptoms which I don't experience. As far as the moral injury piece of it, I mean, Shay talks about that as something that kind of exacerbates or complicates PTSD, and it's really interesting. There's a Holocaust survivor, Jeanne Marie, wrote an essay called "Torture," which is about the experience of being tortured by the Gestapo in Bredonk, and he talks about, in very similar language to the language that Shay later uses, about sort of how the experience of being tortured, it's not just about the pain, but it breaks down his sense of the kind of social contract, right? The kind of unwritten rules that allow you to move through the world and have a certain degree of faith and trust in your fellow man. That just wasn't possible for him. There's sort of in a kind of small way, I remember sort of walking through an Iraqi town in patrol and just thinking like, oh, okay, like there's a kind of sociological condition here that means that I can't walk through this town alone without being, captured. And coming back and like driving down the road and looking at the double yellow line and thinking like, it's just a line. Like we act like it's magical, right? Like somebody's not gonna just come careening into us for no goddamn reason because they could. And I feel like one of the things that happens with a lot of the things in war is that you see how thin that double yellow line can be in all sorts of areas, and whether that is moral injury or just a kind of changed perception of the world that doesn't sort of fit into a clinical context, in the absence of other symptoms, I think that's an important thing. Sometimes we kind of medicalize a lot of the discussion of veterans, even veterans with PTSD. We want to kind of, if we give it, 4 letters, and then we can put a box around all the bad feelings that you have, right? And I think that's insufficient, right? If you're not pissed off and alienated and angry about the way that America has been using, the lives of its Marines. I mean, regardless of your political persuasion, you can't say that the past 15 years have been stellar military policy at all points, right? No one believes that except for Tom. It's all according to his grand plan, and just get that guy after this. And so if you're fucking furious, be like, oh, you have PTSD. It's like, no, like, oh, maybe we can give you a pill and then all those bad feelings will go away. It's like, no, I want a pill so that you feel this way.
Do you feel like there is a way to move towards a less medicalized, a less boxed in approach to the conversation then?
Well, I mean, look, so I want to be careful. Like, discussion of PTSD, discussion of the role that moral injury plays in it, I think is really important within a medical context. What I am always wary of is kind of how those ideas get out into popular culture and start determining how we talk about things. And you know, I've had this experience all the time where we have this sort of assumption that vets are broken, right? I met a guy in a bar once who told me that all Iraq vets were going to snap 10 years after the war. I'd been back 3, so he was like, "You have 7 left." You know,
Make
like,
the best of it.
yeah, like he wasn't trying to be mean. He just like wanted me to know. And yeah, it's just like this weird thing. The first time I ever saw somebody reading a copy of my book, just like on the street, it was in Brooklyn, of course, and I walked up and I was like, "Hey, I wrote that," you know, and they were like, "Oh, cool," you know, they like looked at back cover. They're like, "That's the guy. Yeah, he's not crazy." And then she looks up at me. She goes, "I'm glad you were able to find a job after the war." I'm like, "Thanks." And so, you know, we'd sort of take everything and you know, like if we can medicalize it, then we can explain it away and not think about it, right? And this, I think, happens with a lot outside of just the war context. In the death of Ivan Ilyich, there's a bit where Tolstoy is talking about, you know, Ivan Ilyich is dying, and you know the doctors and everybody's talking about, "Oh, you have a blind kidney, or you have this, or you know," and it's like as if that says anything. And whereas Ivan Ilyich is like, "I don't care that it's a blind kidney or whatever. Let's talk about the fact that I'm dying and what that means." And the other thing is sort of there's this weird way in which I met a veteran who suffers PTSD. And the other thing is like I've friends with PTSD. If you met them, you'd be like, "Oh, one, you know, incredibly thoughtful, intelligent, functional, impressive individual." Like you know, we have this image of, you know, vets walking around like basket cases, and he was like, "Yeah, I don't tell stories about the war anymore because people only want to hear the worst shit that ever happened to me. They don't want to know about the guys in my unit that I love, the good times that we had, what the biggest barracks rat I ever saw was, right? Like it wasn't all, you know, bad times." And part of the problem is, I mean, one thing is it just kind of like reduces that person to this kind of instance of trauma that's somehow supposed to be the magical key unlocking who they are. And whereas actually like a moment of trauma only means anything because of all the things around it, right?
Well, moments of stress in the midst of boredom, that might actually be a good segue into your next section.
Well, and also just like, yeah, the other thing is some people like this, right? Like a lot of people do.
Right.
Okay, so I'll read a little bit of the book. So this is from a Special Forces, this narrator's a Special Forces guy. I'm working on a novel about the post 9/11 U.S. involvement in Colombia, which is interesting to me for a whole variety of reasons, not just because I get to do research and hang out with my wife's family in Medellin, but also because there's a lot of kind of cross-pollination between Colombia and Afghanistan. Okay, I'll just read. My father was a miner back when that was still a thing, back when you could be a miner and think maybe your son might be one too. These days he walks with a stoop in his right shoulder, a gift of a rockfall in '83. He's got arthritis, and there's a delicate way he gets up from low chairs, navigating himself around the damage he's done to his body. His raging tempers, bouts of deep depression, but doing hard work, physical work, he always told me, was the best way of quieting yourself and fastening your mind to God. Though my injuries are very different from his, though his were earned in 4 decades of Pennsylvania coal mines and mine over 15 years of war on 3 continents, still, I like to think that the work I do and the work he did connect us. If you could see me, if you could see the way my men and I prepare our kit, the way we treat the equipment, not with love, not exactly, not the way a gun enthusiast oils an AR or a suburban dad fastens the bits in his $800 power drill. No, with a practiced, unconscious care. If you could see that care and then see the way my father and his men prepared, bringing their gear in line, lamp battery, breathing canister, rock hammer, bringing themselves in line, each limb, each finger a piece of equipment, and you'd see that connection. Men like us are always aware of the tools our lives hang on, their capabilities and weaknesses, just like we're always aware of our bodies, of our pains and limitations, shot knees, shot backs, sore muscles strung across our bones. Always start slow. Test the limits of movement, see if there are any new pains. Most of us in Special Forces are a little older than the average grunt, hopefully a little wiser, a little less bloodthirsty, less eager to prove ourselves. We don't move like 19-year-olds, but when we do move, we're economical, precise. There's something deeply private about those first seconds, preparing your kit for what's to come, preparing your body to handle it. When the work begins, though, stepping out, rushing down the back streets of Baghdad or just below the ridgeline of an Afghan mountain range, you're no longer in yourself. The team's will takes over. It's true that sometimes, especially at the beginning of my career, thoughts of death would sneak in. When I was starting out, not enough of us had died yet for it to become normal, and we're still more accustomed to killing than grieving, which requires different muscles. Muscles my father knew well, having seen violent death in the mines, death where the body was crushed or severed or in some way made inappropriate for display in a coffin. It's hard to explain these things to my wife. She's not from a military family, and the adjustments are hard for her. The time apart, yes, but also the knowledge that there's blood on her husband's hands. An idea that excites some women very different from Natalia. But Natalia keeps me going, Natalia and the kids. They keep me doing this when I've seen so many guys get burned out or jaded or unmoored from anything even approaching a normal civilian life. Our first child came in 2004, right after an Iraq deployment filled with mounting anxiety, not from the violence, but from the knowledge that Natalia was in her third trimester. Me, a soon-to-be new parent, 8 time zones away, and still wrapping my head around the notion of childbirth, around what was happening to Natalia and to me, that we were slowly becoming a family, or perhaps had already become a family, while I was over there, killing.
Conversation and the translation of experience into a way that non-veterans, those who did not serve, can understand what you went through. First of all, who has the burden of figuring that out? The veteran or the civilian who wants to know? And how much of it is...
I mean, I don't know, because this is
Yeah.
not me, right? So,
Well, of course, yes. But
I think, and it's funny. I think there's this sort of assumption that, particularly with war experience, so increasingly with kind of other avenues of experience, that sort of the individual who's experienced something is like the ultimate authority on that thing, right? Like, you can't tell me about war. I was there, and this is like a trope in popular culture. In the book, there's a joke, how many Vietnam vets does it take to screw in a light bulb? You wouldn't know. You weren't there, right? And the kind of civilian, I had this really bizarre experience where I'd written a piece for the New York Times about the experience of watching a Marine die in a combat hospital. And it was a piece about emotional numbness, really, about not being able to really take in or intellectualize some of the things that I'd seen, and so just kind of not emotionally engaging with them at all at the time, and then having them crop up later when I was looking at sort of photographs that a Marine of mine had taken of the event. And this friend of mine who had gone through pretty awful child abuse had read the piece, and it had resonated with her. And she came up to me and she started telling me about the piece and how she felt like I'd articulated some of the sort of feelings that she had gone through in a very different context. And it was sort of powerful conversation. Then in the middle of the conversation, she stopped and she said, "Not that I'm comparing what I've been through to what you've been through. I can never imagine what you've been through." And I thought, this is so bizarre, because I had an easy job in the Marine Corps. I was a staff officer. And she's telling me things that I don't know how I would deal with as an adult, let alone as an 8-year-old, right? And yet she's trusting that communication is possible, that actually some communication has already been made just through the writing of the thing. And I think this notion of kind of this sort of precious notion of only I can talk about war experience is actually sort of deadly for veterans. had a friend who said, somebody asked him if he thought that people could ever understand what he'd been through, and he said, I hope so, because if the answer is no, it means my wife will never understand me, my kids will never understand me, and that means I can never come home. And so, and the other part of it is, oftentimes a lot of us aren't actually that wise about what we've been through until a lot of time and conversation has passed. And I don't just mean this with war experience, right? Like, so I have a 16-month-old baby. If you had asked me what being a father means 16 months ago, I'd have been like, it means this: help! Like, what is this thing? And that would have been about the sum total of my knowledge. And I'd be like, and I cried recently. Joyful tears. That's fatherhood. And there's this bit in Karl Marlantis's What It's Like to Go to War, where he says, ask the 20-year-old combat veteran at the gas station what it feels like to kill a man, and his probable angry answer is going to be, it doesn't feel like a fucking thing. But if you ask the same veteran the same question 40 years later, he says, you're going to get a very different response. And for Marlantes, it's not just about who that guy is and how he processed his experience. It's about the community he had around him, what resources they offered him to help process that and sort of incorporate it into the kind of narrative of his life. And that's done through communication with other people. Communication where you get pushed back against, where, the example I always use is you're in conversation with your friend about your significant other, right? And you're like, oh, my girlfriend is being a terrible person. And they like listen to your story and they're like, actually, you're the douchebag, right? Like, you need to be able to have these conversations where somebody actually feels like they have the right to push back on you. And when I was writing Redeployment, one of the things that was really useful was Colin McCann telling me that something that I'd written was bullshit. And it was so frustrating because this fucking civilian who is nothing about the Iraq War was right. It's obnoxious of him to be right.
But don't you risk in that kind of situation a veteran becoming so bitter in that scenario?
Right.
That it backfires?
And part of the problem, but the other thing is, talking about war experience is never going to be like talking to your wise friend about your girlfriend, because your wise friend is not going to have like talking news, like media pundits, like telling him every day 24/7 exactly how to feel about your relationship with your girlfriend. Like, that doesn't happen, right? Like, so it's this, like, war experience is this intensely private thing, but it's also this really public thing that everybody's engaged in, that everybody should be engaged in, actually, sometimes that you wish more people were engaged in. And people have very strong opinions about what it means, about the morality of it, about the morality of your war, why you served, what you must be like, what kind of person you must be to have done this. And so there's just these thickets of bullshit that you need to wade through to have a halfway decent conversation with anybody. And a lot of times, a lot of vets just get frustrated. It's like, it's not worth the effort. I was talking to one guy, and he was like, I just don't tell war stories because I'm tired of people assuming I have PTSD, because I don't like do the kind of moral hand waving about fucked up things that I've seen, because I've dealt with it, So I'll tell a story, and among other vets, I'll be like, okay, we'll talk about this story because we all kind of understand the context, whereas it's so shocking. One of my Marines found that when he went to college, he was like, I'm surrounded by these 18-year-old kids. They tell a story, and I'd be like, oh, that's cool. And I'd tell a story, they'd be like, oh shit,
Context means everything.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, one of the things that I keep coming back to in the consideration of moral injury specifically is that my thought and my own definition of morality and the foundations on which it's built could be drastically different from yours. So even within the veteran community, you have to come from this complex approach of, we're all going to have different definitions. That's one of the reasons why Shay had such a multi-layered definition of PTSD, because you're never going to put your finger on it. And but one of the common themes in war literature and just the conversation about war in general is rage. Homer's Iliad, as translated by Stanley Lombardo, that we used for our series, the very first word is rage. Why do you think that is such a common reaction? And do you think that it's useful in the conversation?
Yeah, maybe should I read the opening of
You
Bodies?
can do whatever you want.
That might. So I'll read the opening of Bodies and I'll talk about that question because I think it's related. This story is called Bodies. For a long time, I was angry. I didn't want to talk about Iraq, so I wouldn't tell anybody I'd been. And if people knew, if they pressed, I'd tell them lies. There was this Haji corpse, I'd say, lying in the sun. It'd been there for days. It was swollen with gases. The eyes were sockets, and we had to clean it off the streets. Then I'd look at my audience and size them up, see if they wanted me to keep going. You'd be surprised how many do. That's what I did, I'd say. I collected remains, U.S. forces mostly, but sometimes Iraqis, even insurgents. There are two ways to tell the story, funny or sad. Girls like it sad, with a 1,000-yard stare out to the distance as you gaze on the horrors of war they can't quite see. Guys like it funny, with lots of gore and a grin on your face when you get to the end. Either way, it's the same story. This lieutenant colonel who's visiting the government center rolls up, sees two Marines maneuvering around a body bag, and decides he'll go show what a regular guy he is and help. As I tell the story, the lieutenant colonel's a large, arrogant bear of a man with fresh-pressed camis and a short, tight mustache. He's got huge hands, I'd say. And he comes up to us and he says, "Here, Marine, let me help you with that." And without waiting for us to respond or warn him off, he reaches down and he grabs the body bag. Then I'd describe how he launches up as though he's doing a clean and jerk. He was strong, I'll give him that, I'd say. But the bag rips on the edge of the truck's back gate and the skin of the Haji tears with it a big, jagged tear through the stomach. Rotting blood and fluid and organs slide out like groceries through the bottom of a wet paper bag. Human soup hits him right in the face, running down his mustache. If I'm telling the story sad, I can stop there. If I'm telling it funny, though, there's one more crucial bit, which Corporal G had done when he told the story to me for the first time back in 2004, before either of us had collected remains or knew what we were talking about. I don't know where G heard the story. The colonel screamed like a bitch, G had said. And then he'd made a weird, high-pitched keening noise deep in his throat, like a wheezing dog. This was to show us precisely how bitches scream when covered in rotting human fluids. If you get the noise right, you get a laugh. What I liked about this story was that even if it had happened, more or less, it was still total bullshit. After our deployment, there wasn't anybody, not even Corporal G, who talked about the remains that way. Some of the mortuary affairs Marines thought the spirits of the dead hung about the bodies. It'd creep them out. You could feel it, they'd say, especially when you look at the faces. But it got to be more than that. Midway through the deployment, guys started swearing they could feel spirits everywhere, not just around the bodies, and not just Marine dead, Sunni dead, Shia dead, Kurd dead, Christian dead. All the dead of all Iraq, even all the dead of all Iraqi history, the Akkadian Empire and the Mongols and the American invasion. I never felt any ghosts. Leave a body in the sun, the outer layer of skin detaches from the lower, and you feel it slide around in your hands. Leave a body in water, everything swells and the skin feels waxy and thick, but it's recognizably human. That's all. Except for me and Corporal G, though. Everybody in mortuary affairs talked about ghosts. We never said any different. So that's bodies.
That, yeah. Yeah. But what's interesting about that story, even though it is going for that humorous take on, judging one's audience, it still opens with anger.
Right. It's anger, and it's anger towards the audience that he's manipulating, right? And um, and anger about the experience that he's had. I think, I mean, I certainly felt a certain degree of anger coming back. I came back and I was like, look, we're at war. The decisions that we're making here, politically, in America, the consequences are measured in human lives, right? American, also mostly Iraqi. And to me, it felt like nobody gave a shit. Like, it's weird now looking back on it, because like that was actually like a high watermark of people giving a shit about the war, right? Like General Petraeus and Ryan Crocker came when I was in Iraq in 2007 to like testify about how the surge was going, and it was a political circus. And MoveOn.org took out like a full-page ad in the New York Times to accuse General Petraeus of being General Petraeus, which is just lame. On a, come on, guys. Be more literary than that. But and now it's like, you know, it's almost like that. Like it's like, God, like how do we get anybody to even talk about it? Let's drop the biggest like non-nuclear bomb that we have, and then maybe people will talk about the war for a second. Like, and so
or wax poetic on
right.
Fox and Friends.
And but there's this real frustration and anger. But the thing that gets complicated about it is, especially with wars that have lasted this long. So one thing, I had vets in the audience who, you ever hear somebody say the phrase like, "We were at war and America was at the mall." You know that, right? We were at war and America was at the mall. You hear somebody say that, and you're like, yeah, fuck yeah. And then like 5 years later, you're like, hey man, what's up? What are you up to? He's like, I'm going to the mall. America's still at war, but I need socks. And I like, so you have this weird space that you're in where it's like, I got out of the military, and I'm like in a bar in Brooklyn. Some like hipster band is like setting up their like ukulele set, and I get a phone call and like, hey, so-and-so got shot in Afghanistan. Like, he's okay. And so it's bizarre, but then also you like move back into your normal life. And I think, one of the reasons that I started writing this, the character that I read in this novel was, a lot of the characters in Redeployment are these young guys, right? But I was interested in like, okay, what about somebody who's chosen this life and likes it? It's not hard and kind of morally bruising, and really, really, really fucking hard, but he really likes it. There's a lot of people like that, and they get it, not just a huge kind of sense of satisfaction to it. I was talking to a buddy, and he said, and he was like, war's not the place I felt the most fully realized. Because that's, as a writer, as a father, that it caused me to explore aspects of myself that I didn't know about. But it is where I felt the most purely realized. Being in a place, knowing exactly who I was, where I was, who was around me, what I was doing. Like, that's the pure hit, right? I'll always miss it. And then, of course, you have that huge sense of purpose and meaning, being in a war zone where, like, even, tying your shoelaces correctly before you go on a patrol in Afghanistan has, sort of moral consequences. And then kind of coming back and looking at it from a distance and going like, okay, that individual mission, whatever, everything felt like it had a big sense of purpose, but now what's happening there, right? Talking to a guy who had been in Sangin province, right? And just, lost friends, went through a grueling deployment. They felt like they'd really achieved things while they were there, and then they left, a couple more U.S. units rotated in, then within a year, it was back to Afghan security forces, and the governor of the province was saying Sangin's an open space for the Taliban. It's like, all right, what the hell was that, and how do I reconcile those things? And it becomes really, really, really complicated kind of space for people to to sort of operate in, where these global decisions that are so far outside of your control, outside of the control of any one person, feel so central to your very core of who you are.
But that can translate into specific, like if you think about the special forces guy that you just read, when you're down on the ground and you're in that small cohesive unit, those big world decisions can feel distilled down into that one village where you're operating. And so there seems to be a difficulty to make the distinguish between what I'm doing here on the ground and whether or not that has a true influence on the larger picture. And that seems to be part of the complication about moral injury. Where can I actually draw the line of what I was responsible for, what I wasn't responsible for, and how do I come to that decision?
Yeah. And you know, one of the things is just it makes such a difference. Not just what kind of mission you're doing in the moment, like what kind of unit you have, whether you have a good commander or a bad one. What the sort of unit you're in, and then kind of, you know, what kind of network you go back to when you come home. You know, there's a way in which a lot of times the sort of you know, there's some guys who actually find war easier than overseas. I was talking to a reservist who's like, Afghan deployment got canceled. He was like, yeah, some of the guys in the unit are like, holy shit. Like, I was expecting to put my civilian life stuff on hold, you know? Like, civilian life is hard. And like, when I'm in Afghanistan, I'd be like, don't you support the troops? And then sometimes people are like, no. I knew a unit was on a 16-month deployment, and the guy used to, the S1 used to brief the divorce rate every morning. But yeah, so then, you know, then you sort of come home and it's like, you know, oh, what I was doing over there has this sort of intensity to it. And like, I think every veteran has had the Hurt Locker moment where the guy's in the grocery store looking at all the like cereal and it's like, what the fuck is this? These series of meaningless choices that I'm offered constantly, right? I think there's a way in which you kind of, for some people, you come back and like everything seems like that, right? And yet, like the kind of small day-to-day pain in the ass, like getting up, putting your pants on, going to the store, getting food, buying diapers for your baby or whatever, like that's the basic stuff of making a life, right? So, you know, like putting a steel beam on another steel beam, not quite as sort of dramatic as 9/11, but ultimately sort of more important. And so sort of guys learning to balance, like, okay, how do I kind of be a kind of cohesive individual who's doing that day-to-day work of being a full person and then also managing operating in a combat zone where kind of the global strategy is out of my control and even you know, maybe maybe not really, there might not even be anybody guiding the wheel. Sometimes seems to be the way that American military policy is going. And yet that doesn't mean that you're not still making a series of really important moral choices along the way.
I keep coming back in my head to the word reconciliation, not just between veterans and civilians, but also between the U.S. and allied forces and the host peoples of the countries where we are. And there are several points in redeployment where Iraqis play parts. Specifically in Frago, there's 2 torture victims. I think it's 2, maybe it might
2.
just be 1. Yeah. And part of the problem was the Marines did their job and they saved them, but in a way they committed more of a sin by saving them because then they have to face their death. Like, I'm not sure if I have a question with that necessarily, but this idea of reconciliation of what you've done, what the outcome is. Sort of ambiguous end there, sorry.
Yeah, well, so I don't think it's that they feel that they did a worse thing by saving them. So the thing is, in the story, there are 2 torture victims who were set up. This is actually based on a real story. It happened when I was in Iraq. Al-Qaeda in Iraq had captured these 2 Iraqi security forces guys, and they'd tortured them. They'd taken a power drill and drilled through their ankles, and then they set them up in front of a video camera, and they were like, okay, now we're going to cut off your head on camera. And then they realized that they were out of film. And so like, okay, like we need to go find some film. And when they were out getting film, a Marine squad hit that house and rescued the guys. And when we heard about it, we're like, oh, this is a great story. Like, you know, because we didn't know the full details of what had happened. It's like, oh, these guys were about to be executed, and then like in the nick of time, like they saved them. Like, this is wonderful. And I remember going over to TQ Surgical, the surgical shock trauma platoon hospital there, and you know, to sort of see these guys, and the surgeons were just like, no, it's, you know, they're out on painkillers right now. Like, what happened to them is horrible, and just like, it's not what you think. It's not the good news story that you think. It's a better news story than them being executed. But there's not like a lot to sort of feel wonderful about when you're sort of, you know, looking on two tremendously shattered bodies. I'm a real upper.
Yeah. Well, and like I said, I brought that up thinking that I would have a question, so I apologize for not having a question. It just so Phil and I first met when I went to a Q&A for the Hunter MFA fiction program. I had met Colin McCann not too long before that, and he said, I have a Marine in my unit, or in my...
In his unit?
In his unit, yeah. I have a Marine in
Apparently
my program
I rubbed off
also,
on Colin.
and you should come and talk to him. And over the course of those next several years, I learned that while Phil was at Quantico, Virginia, at the basic school where every Marine officer learns how to be a basic infantry officer, he got bored, and he memorized the entirety of T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland. So, let's go. First 10 lines.
I did this like, this is in 2005.
Canto 1,
April
The
is
Burial of the Dead.
April's the cruelest month, breeding lilacs out of the dead land, mixing memory and desire, storing dull roots with spring rain. Winter kept us warm, covering earth in forgetful snow, feeding little life with dry tuber.
We
Summer
get it,
surprises
we
came
get
with
it,
the storm,
we
gazed
get
in a
it.
shower of rain. We stopped in the colony. Went
This
on the
is
hot garden, drank
what
coffee,
a
talked for
really
an hour, big
smart
archive
guy
missions, and
does
lost
in the
literature.
Marine
All right, so
Corps.
this is what I did. So, like, military training is boring. Every veteran in the audience can, like, attest that. You think it's going to be, like, go, 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 like you're in helicopters and you're, like, hitting each other and, like, you know, like, crawling under barbed wire while people yell at you, which is exciting for some reason, you think. And, like, you do all those things, but in between doing all those things, you just, like, just not, like, you just, it's so boring. You're, like, just sitting in, like, the freezing Quantico behind your rifle in the woods with, like, an MRE packet in your cargo pocket so your body heat
Waiting
will
for the
thaw it out enough to
ambush.
be, like, semi-edible later on. And, like, what I wanted to do was just bring books and read, but if, you know, some first sergeant had seen me reading, he would have murdered me, justly. And so I printed out poems, and I would, like, cut them up into index card site pieces, and I'd bring them out, and so I'd, like, be behind my rifle, or, like, be humping, and just, like, have a card to, you know, read a line, recite it to myself. And the reason I ultimately went with The Wasteland is, like, stuff that rhymed, you went through too quick, and there was just way too much boredom to deal with. I was once we were, like, in a training area, and we were waiting for a helicopter to pick us up, and everybody was just kind of bullshit. This has nothing to do with the topic, but I'll tell you the story anyway, since you brought it up. And I'm like, you know, everybody's like, you know, one guy's like reading a Maxim, one guy's like scratching himself vigorously with both hands. There's like spitting tobacco, and another guy. And I'm like with these cards, just kind of like memorizing The Wasteland. And this captain is like this big, ripped, angry, like infantry captain. He's like a combat veteran from Iraq. He's like looking around, like, you know, like, who should I be most disgusted by? Right? Like, we're all scum. And he's like, I have no idea what that guy's doing. I'm going to ask him. So he goes up to me. He's like, what are you doing? I'm like, oh, I'm memorizing The Wasteland, and I'm memorizing poetry. And he's just like this is not what he thought I was going to say. So it takes him like a while to sort of process. And I'm like, you know, why not exercise the brain a little, you know? And there's like this big angry guy, like responsible for getting us ready for war, who's just like, fuck this, officer. And he's like, you like memorizing poetry. What are the elements of a 9-line? Have you memorized that? Right? 9-line is how you call for a casualty evacuation. It's got 9 elements. I don't know any of them. So I was like, oh no. And he's like, when your Marines are dying, what are you going to do? Recite poetry at them? Which I wasn't really planning on doing, but so I got out my platoon commander's notebook and memorized it. No, he didn't bother anybody else, right? Like the guy scratching himself, just happily. It's like, that's going to save your Marines one day, somehow.
And with that.
Okay.
So on that note, thank you. Thank our
Thank you,
guests.
Mariette.
And we have a good amount of time for some questions. You guys are game for some questions?
Yeah.
I think our audience has some. I'm doing a little verbal dance here, waiting for my microphone. Here it comes. And thanks. And so we'll start right over here. And just if you can talk into the mic, because we do have guests who are watching us online. Here it comes. This way. We got.
Right there.
Yep.
Guy in the white shirt.
We got it.
Several of your narrators use a very distinctive dialect, both in syntax and vocabulary. And the dialect communicates very effectively this bond that they have among the troops, but also how isolated they are from the world they're going to go back to,
Yeah.
that they do go back to. And so I think that illustrates a real conflict between, they have a choice between staying in the familiar world or leaving it, and often they go back and forth. How did you develop that idea?
The language. Yeah, it's I didn't want, I wanted a range of voices and perspectives, right? So some of the narrators are kind of more, kind of closer to maybe your average sort of civilian reader of literary fiction in terms of their sensibilities, right, and the things that they're concerned with. The chaplain, I think, probably would be one of these guys. But the Marine Corps has its own very distinct culture, ethos, set of values, and language, right? And most of that's profanity and acronyms, but not all. And so, I mentioned earlier the first story in the book is maybe the kind of most common type of war story that we hear. And then the second story, Frago, the first page is just like a bunch of acronyms, right? So even just sort of looking at the page, it's like, oh, this is, and that narrator is probably the most unapologetically Marine narrator, right? He's not going to dumb it down. He's not going to explain things for you. He's not going to do the kind of moral hand-wringing that some of the other narrators will do. And it was very interesting, actually, when I was writing that story. And it was important to me to have him be a little, to be alienated, for that shift to occur. I would get very different types of responses from civilian and veteran readers. And frequently, veteran readers would read that story, which is about the torture victims, and he takes his Marines through, and there's a moment where they start kind of talking about how messed up everything is, and he makes like a really dirty joke to kind of cut off the conversation. And a lot of veterans would read the story and go, oh, this is a portrait of really good NCO leadership, right? And then I'd have civilian readers read the story and they'd be like, this man is a moral monster, right? And I don't say that to be like the vets are right and the civilians are wrong necessarily, but that his his worldview is a particular one, and it's wrapped up, and I try to be true to the way that he would express it and the rhythm of it. You know, when we're talking about military language, there's a lot of, you know, profanity. There's a lot of acronyms. It's not just because you know men are gross or whatever, and that's how the language comes out. It's not, you know, a lot of times people talk about acronyms as if the military only uses acronyms to obscure things, or that like using acronyms is about, you know, oh, because we don't want to look at violence. I read one commentary, oh, they have all these acronyms so they don't talk about violence. Like, you know, when military people talk about violence, they're not afraid to describe it, right? Amongst themselves. But acronyms they're a part of the culture. They're a technical language for describing very precise things. They're a shorthand, and sometimes acronyms have a real emotional impact. To a veteran of Iraq or Afghanistan, IED has more emotional impact than improvised explosive device, right? Which is what that stands for. And so it was important to me to get that at the level of the language. Then as far as the sort of profanity and grossness of it, you know, if you're dealing with narrators who are 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, something like that, and they're dealing with, you know, their friends being killed or blown up, or seeing people blown up or horribly injured, or seeing children horribly injured. You know, my chaplain when I was in Iraq, so military triage, you know, sort of this, in a mass casualty is kind of a cold process. It's like if you can't save somebody, you give them pain, something for the pain, and then you move on to the people that you can do something about. But nobody would ever want to just sort of leave somebody to die in a corner, particularly not if it's a child. So my chaplain, Chaplain McLaughlin, a wonderful guy who's a father of 5, took it upon himself to hold Iraqi children while they were dying. And eventually the corpsman actually built him rocking chairs for him to do it, because he was doing it on his knees at first. They called them combat rocking chairs. You know, you have young people trying to describe experiences like that. They're going to reach for the most brutal and vile language that they possibly can, because to do anything else would be a lie. And yeah, though I will say that profanity and acronyms are the #1 source of 1-star reviews on Amazon for my books. So. Though my favorite 1-star review is, so in Amazon there's like a title of the review, and then there's like the body of the review, and the title of the review was, "Can't believe it, this won any awards. Guy shoots a dog. Who would do that?" And then the body of the review was, "Shoots a dog."
Well, one thing to consider about acronyms and such also is that it's the language of the initiated and the non-initiated. So to leave that out would be to call into question the veracity of the story itself. So if you don't have the acronyms, how much can you be relied on to be telling the truth? Yeah.
Thank you. I have a very specific question about one of your stories, but
Yep.
before I do that, I'm going to offer an observation, and I'm crossing a boundary here, and I apologize for it.
Go for it.
But you said very clearly that you think you don't have post-traumatic stress. You also mentioned a 16-month-old child. I was back from Vietnam for 20 years when my daughter was born, and looking back at it, I can trace the evolution of my post-traumatic stress from the birth of that child, and the quality of interactions that I had with her that just ripped open the mask. And
I had, you know, the first Memorial Day that I had with my son, I was holding him and rocking him, and you know, like Memorial Day is not the happiest of days in general, but you know, it was the first Memorial Day I'd had as a father, and I was just holding him, and all of a sudden, you know, I was just thinking of like how much I loved him, how much my wife and I had sacrificed for him, what this thing was, that I was still trying to get a hold of. And it was the first time that I really thought about people that I knew had died, not just as Marines and people I'd known, but as sons and daughters, and I thought about the kids, and I just started crying. So yeah, I did have, you know, having a son did kind of, it certainly has changed me in various ways, and my relationship to some of the things in war certainly changed, absolutely.
I wanted to ask you about a word choice in your story, Prayer in the Furnace.
Sure.
It's the chaplain at the memorial service. And Mariette mentioned that Jonathan Shea talked about moral injury in terms of betrayal. And there's an echo in what the chaplain is saying here from Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. I don't know if you're aware of it, but this is on page 131 at Fujita's memorial service. I read, and you say 2 Timothy, although I think with the new administration it has to be 2 Timothy.
2 Timothy,
That's,
got it, yeah.
He said, I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. During memorials, I try at best I can to set an appropriate tone. And it's that word appropriate. And I think of Lincoln saying it is altogether fitting and proper that we do this in the Gettysburg Address. And in what follows in the next couple of paragraphs, we have the friend Rodriguez talking about Fujita as the only person who liked the people in Iraq. And then we have and somebody else talking about how much he hated them. What is this? Halpert says, if you fuck with us, you will live in shit. And they're like, okay, we'll live in shit. And it's that juxtaposition of the guy who dies is the only one who thinks anything of them, and with the coda that they're shit, and the chaplain trying to decide what's appropriate in that context. And so that word appropriate to me is not just a word. There's a world of meaning in there.
I was thinking the line from David Jones, a soldier in an attack in World War I, helloing the official blasphemies. And yeah, sort of what's appropriate in each context is certainly something that story is very concerned with. I didn't actually connect it to the Gettysburg Address, but yeah.
But the chaplain eventually learns that no matter what he tries to do or say, he doesn't find that appropriate tone. He's always
so
grasping.
Part of the it's so he tries to push back on them, and they're not interested in it. Though I think he's a complicated relationship with Rodriguez, so he's sort of searching for something that he can do. But he knows that he's not just there. That being a minister to these men doesn't just mean soothing them if they're doing something wrong. Yeah. Oh dear.
You knew I was gonna.
I've known Tom since I was an undergraduate. Yeah. And
Yeah.
He's responsible for.
I take no responsibility.
Yeah. So
No.
much of the corruption.
I know exactly. I just want to say it's really wonderful to hear both you guys talk, and the new work sounds good, Phil. So anyway, and it's kind of eloquence that and plain spokenness, which I really love. So this question is kind of odd, and both of you can respond however you like. But Phil, I remember, and this, I think it has to do with what you were saying earlier about these kind of large-scale decisions which affect you at the very core of your being, and which you, of course, have absolutely no control over. So I remember once we had a conversation in which you were telling me what it was like, your drill instructor was like, and that he was very much it was all theatrical. He knew he was fucking with your head, and he knew that you knew he was fucking with your head. And the context of it was, there is an Iraqi child, with a weapon coming towards you. What do you do? Et cetera, et cetera. And of course, the answer is I shoot her, right?
Well, no, it was so that guy was interesting. Oh, yeah, go on.
But anyway, so the question. It was this, and then we talked about it for a while, and you said, yeah, I knew he was fucking my head, and he knew that I was, and this kind of whole feedback loop. And you said, and the thing I'll never forget you said is that, it's theatrical, and it's kind of horseshit, but it works.
Yeah.
And that's really the question. Now that you've got, and it ties in with another thing, and I'll try to be brief. Yeah, I was in Jordan doing a piece on Syrian refugees, and I went to a very conservative Islamic college where they'd read Foucault. Now, don't ask me, but that's what they do there. So in any case, a woman said to me, raised her hand and said, well, do you really think that you can get beyond your ideological formation as an American? And that's kind of the question I want to ask. How does the writing for you guys mediate between your ideological formation as a Marine on the one hand, and then this kind of wised up, I know this is theater, this is theater, but it still works.
Right. Well, and that's the kind of question I ask myself constantly when I'm trying to write anybody because I'm not interested in writing somebody who is espousing the philosophy of Phil Clyde. And I'm also always writing somebody who's going to have experiences that are going to relate to people who've had similar things that are sacred to them, right? Bound up in pride and rage and pain sometimes. And early on I thought about this and I was like, well, what right do I have to write these stories? And I realized that I don't actually have the right to, I don't think you have a right to write stories about anything, about yourself, right? Like my story, if I were write my life story, everybody that I know would probably have strong disagreements with pieces of it, right? Because we all lie to ourselves. And so I sort of decided well, there's no right to tell a story, there's only doing it well, right? And it's kind of helped along by all the bullshit memoirs that I had read. I'm not just talking about war memoirs or Navy SEAL memoirs. But that a lot of people aren't sort of honest even with themselves. And so I kind of wrote this book with this sort of sense of terror, right? This kind of imaginary line of veterans waiting to kick the shit out of me for getting it wrong. And I thought that was really important. And then also with this sense that unless I was pissing them off at the same time, I probably wasn't doing it right in some way. That I could only justify myself with kind of an honesty, and that meant spending a lot of time trying to get out of my head. These kind of debates in literature about who has the right to write, and sort of well, we write outside of ourselves. It's the whole point of doing it. And that's true, but I think that it's something that should always be approached with this sort of sense of kind of dread. And I joke that whenever I'm writing a nonfiction op-ed, that my working title is always "Fuck all you fucking fuckers," including myself. And that if you don't include yourself in it, it's going to be crap. And that's all you can do. I think that, ultimately, you either think that kind of cross-cultural stuff is possible, and you can look at the, history of humankind and the way that ideas cross-pollinate and think that, yeah, it's fucking possible. And you think of, I think of Francois Mauriac in his Nobel Prize speech in 1952, talking about sort of being amazed that anybody cared. I was going to say gave a shit about rural France. That's not what he said in his Nobel Prize speech in 1952. That anybody cared about his little corner of provincial France. And he says, we always believe in our own uniqueness and forget that the novels that we read, that we loved as a child, that spoke to us, that described our lives to us, were about people from radically different cultures who lived lives nothing like ours. And so I think that, kind of immersing yourself in the really foreign is very important. Having a sense of respect for that, but the idea that it's utterly incommunicable, I think, is toxic nonsense ultimately.
Mm-hmm. Well, and part of the problem is we will never be able to move beyond those innate filters and concepts that we have embedded in us. But the whole point of writing, as Colin likes to say, write towards what you don't know. And I always took that as part of that consideration, that reading fiction and reading about people and places that you have never had an interaction with creates empathy. There have been studies to show that those who read fiction are more empathetic towards those that they would not normally interact with. And I mean, if we look at our president, who seems to not read, I feel like the whole point of writing is to open up that empathy, open up that question of how similar are we? Because in the end, we are all people just trying to make do with
Also,
our
the
lives.
difference gives you useful tools. That's the other thing, right? Like, okay, I'm not going to understand the Iliad the way Homer understood it, but I know all sorts of stuff about that book that he had no idea. Like, for example, that he had no clue how they used chariots, right? And he got the armor wrong. And I have the whole wealth of like Western, like all civilizations, like study of war to inform my reading of that book. I know all kinds of stuff that classical age Greek does not know. I don't think there's this kind of like the importance of that context. I think it can't be discarded. But the kind of this really precious, intense grasp on it, I think is just kind of like this desperate claim for a kind of stamp of authority that is actually really kind of limiting and isolating, not just for the outside person, but for the person within. Because I find that I only learn about my own experience by exposing it to threat, right? I'm not just talking about war experience, but like I only learn what I've been through and who I am by kind of, loosening up some of those ideas that I hold on to so tightly.
First of all, I read the book. It's terrific.
Thank you.
What story was the hardest one for you to write?
I mean, they're different, right? And they were hard in different ways. It's not. I mean, it's all it's all hard. I mean, some of them were sort of more technically difficult psychological operations. I knew that the end of the story, I wanted it. It doesn't have the shape that a story is supposed to have, and I knew that. And I for what I wanted it to do, I knew it couldn't have that. And I knew that I wanted the end of the story to be a guy telling the reader a story about telling a girl a story, about telling his dad a story, about telling an insurgent thing. And that's obnoxious. And I wanted to do it as like painlessly as possible. Others were kind of just meant staying in a very dark place for a long time. Others were just like a pain in the neck to get the voice right. Sometimes the first story I started writing, the first sentence was "We shot dogs." And I was like, that's the guy's voice. It took me 2.5 years to finish it. But I had the voice from the outset. Bodies, like that line came, I don't know how many drafts of that story I'd written, and the order totally flipped around. So it was just very different, very, very different. War Stories, the first half I wrote in one gulp and didn't even change that much. And the second half I wrote like 19 different versions.
But what about those ones where you stayed in the dark place? Like, did you feel like you had to actually put yourself like into an emotional space that felt more realistic for the character?
I mean, like everything in the story feels really personal. So you're writing things that are very dark, right? You're drawing on. I've only got my own emotional palette to draw on, right? And some of them were sort of like, I wrote a story called "In Vietnam They Had Whores," and it's like really, it's about sexual violence and misogyny as much as it is about war. And I wrote it. It was one of these things where like you write it and you think like, all right, I'm writing this. Nobody needs to read it. And then you're like, shit, I think it's good. And I think it says something that's going to be important to the collection that needs to be in there. But now my grandma's going to read it. It's kind of a weird.
I think your book is quite revolutionary compared to war fiction starting on World War I, and that is most of the preceding books tell the trajectory from a civilian to a soldier, and kind of compare soldierdom as the shock. Whereas it seems to me you do the opposite. You sort of start in the middle and then you go down, and then in a way civilian life is the shock. Do you have anything to say to that?
Yeah, I mean, well, it's an all-volunteer military, right? So it's just guys who wanted to be there, right? And that creates a very different relationship to the war. I mean, a lot of times, why you're there makes more sense than the bizarre reactions to the war, or you as a veteran, that you get when you get home. So I think it just kind of naturally proceeded out of what seems so distinct about these wars. I mean, it's also an old story, right? Like the Odyssey. But the choice, the choice to go to war, I think is pretty important, right? Yeah.
Well, do you think that maybe there was this kind of boredom or frustration with that question that every veteran gets? Like,
Yeah, that's the
why
other
did
thing,
you
right, yeah.
join?
So like at a certain point, I've been asked why you joined the military so many goddamn times. Like at a certain point, I was like, I thought like maybe I should just have it printed on like a card and I just hand it out. Like I had this like narrative. It's really clean. Yeah, so maybe that might be a part of just being bored of the question. Because you get it constantly, right? Especially in New York, where people are like, and it's really a friend, and so he's a poet. He's a black guy, and we were and we're in the panel, and there's just people like don't understand that like a smart, thoughtful, empathetic guy would like join the Marine Corps, and they just like really want like it's because you were poor and had no options, right? And like in many like at Adventures is like I wanted to join the Marine Corps since I was 4 years old, like get over it. Because so.
Yeah, and I think it's also if you consider World War I and then World War II, an entire section of the globe was at war. So, and also World War I was this historical, new, technologically driven. It was beyond anything anyone had thought war could be. Like the last significant, if I remember my history correctly, was Napoleon, which was still this romantic, gentlemanly type of war, whereas World War I was it was basically no man's land and the earth torn up. So I think that has to do, like the majority of, with the exception of on-the-ground infantry and special forces, as we saw demonstrated a couple weeks ago, fire and forget type weapons. You shoot them, you forget about them, it's beyond the line of the horizon. Even drone pilots who still have a video feed live of what they're doing, it's still distant. You're still detached. And so I think there might be this kind of consideration of the type of warfare also.
Though you did have, like in the Middle Ages, you're like, all right, let's take this rotting cow and like catapult it into the town so it spreads disease. Yeah.
Hey, Phil.
How's it going?
Yeah, pretty good, man. Pretty good. I wanted to say that, I'm still, I don't get starstruck often. I said this when I first met you, but this book is so profound. There's so many stories in this that were just, they nailed it. And you've been up there talking, and you just really understand something that I think is so important to understand about war and coming home and healing from that. And one of the great stories, I think, inside your book was OIF. And it confuses the shit out of people. And it's so important, right? Because war is so goddamn confusing. And you really don't have to understand anything besides those three. those two things, WIA, KIA.
Yeah.
And I thought you really nailed it. And I think a lot of civilians don't get that story, and they lose the point of it.
You know what I think? I think people, I blame fucking Google.
Yeah.
Because I think people think that they
Fucking
need to understand the acronyms. And what they don't get is like, I wrote that story so that no one would understand all the
Exactly.
acronyms, right? Because, so that story opens up with like, he's like, this unit did this unit did that. It's different acronyms from different MOSs. I have Marine acronyms. I have National Guard acronyms, Army acronyms, civilian acronyms in that story. An acronym that like only me and one National Guard unit like probably know, right? And I may have gotten the letters wrong. So, and it's you know, it's like this crazy institutional sort of bureaucratic thing, but as you know, some of those acronyms carry a lot of emotional force, and I think people get tripped up on thinking like, oh, I need to understand all this jargon to know what this is about, and it's like, you don't actually.
Isn't that a metaphor for these wars, though? I mean, like, right? I mean, it's so, what's Sunni, what's Shiite? I mean, it's all this confusion about these wars, and it's, you know, we really don't have to understand it at that level. It's a much easier thing to understand sometimes for me. And so I have a question for you. So the whole thing is about the experience of war and you know, repair and transformation and healing from this. So how do you think, since we're still at war, can the soldiers and the veterans that are home, do you think they're healing? And what kind of experience do you think, you know, you bring up the Odyssey a lot, and I just went through it with a veteran group and stuff, and it was really incredible to go through it. And one of the things that we were hung up on is the suitors, right? The suitors, yeah. What is the suitors? And what I really believe the suitors are is the residue of war, right? And what do you think that the suitors are happening inside of America because of, you know, we're at 16 years almost of war. What do you think that residue of this has happened to America?
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot.
And
the suitor's a threat to the family, right? And I mean, I mentioned, you know, the S1 briefing the divorce rate every morning. I just think the strain on family, right? Like you think of like kind of the most basic defining unit of who people, you know, of belonging, which is so important coming back, right? Like having a community where you belong, right, is part of that, I think, healing process, and that sort of slow process, even as the wars go on, which I think continues to bring up issues for people. Sort of developing a strong network and community that you can be sustained by is critical, and that you can talk with, and you know, one of the things is that it kind of puts stress on all those relationships that people have. I don't know if any of you read Brian Kastner's recent piece in the New York Times about the EOD tech who was killed around Thanksgiving last year. And, you know, he was talking to one of the guy's friends about why this guy had just been deploying over and over again on these incredibly dangerous jobs. And the guy said, I'm going to mangle the quote, he says, you know, like, Uncle Sam's got some loyal sled dogs who are just going to pull and pull and pull till their hearts burst. And I think one of the you know, we're talking about responsibility is there's almost like too much of it. You know, what your responsibility as a citizen, your responsibility as a veteran, as a soldier in a time of war, there's sort of more than anybody can sort of process or deal with. And I think it's kind of like a slow space of carving out an understanding of what you can control, how you can move forward, be, you know, sort of kind of good man, good citizen, be it a part of the, you know, something sustaining in American life rather than tearing it down. And I think you see a lot of veterans doing that. I think one of the interesting things about a lot of our generation of vets after the wars is that there's a lot of reach back to people's communities. I know one vet who joined the Park Service after the war. He said he didn't feel like he'd completed his service until he'd, like dug trail with his own hands in his own country. I think of organizations like Team Rubicon, which tries to kind of take the skills that vets have. You know, a lot of times civilian audiences are surprised when I point out that veterans vote more, donate more to charity, and are part of civic groups and charitable organizations at a greater rate than their peers. We also commit fewer murders. And that kind of, you know, we talked about sort of moral injury and post-traumatic stress and that breakdown of trust that happens, that's sort of so, that sense of betrayal. And then you see a lot of the actions that a lot of vets are doing seems to be directly related to sort of projecting faith into, you know, it's a kind of broader civic project.
Thank you. And thank you so much. You said you enjoy a book that's so
Sure.
I did. I enjoyed it. But I have a question for you,
Thank you.
in your future writing, and that is how you will write more from a woman's perspective. So you have
One of the main characters is a woman in the book that I'm working on.
Oh, good. Because you
Yeah.
you have 7 women in this collection, and 2 of them are with the military.
Yep.
And I enjoyed the little bit that I got from them. So good. I'm hoping that you'll write more about them.
Yeah.
Because you said earlier in answer to another question, you know, we guys. As you well know, I don't need to tell
Sure,
you, there are
yeah,
many
absolutely.
women who are in the military as well. So good. Well, I'm looking forward to the next one and seeing more portrayals of women.
Yes, I you know, and as I said, it's important to me to have that in the collection to be, I mean, just to be an accurate portrayal of military life. You have to include women in the things that they're doing. You know, they're an integral part of the armed forces, but you know, it's you know, I never intended the book as a kind of compendium of military life. Like it was, you know, the stories were driven by the kind of questions that I was asking myself, and that's what determined the narrators. I wasn't kind of being like, I need like an Iraqi narrator, and I need a family member, and I need like this kind of, you know. Because I think that would be a self-defeating project, right? Or at least it wouldn't be a generator for good fiction. But yeah, so yeah, there's a female narrator, is one of the main narrators of the novel that I'm working on. I hope you like her. If people don't, I'm gonna blame you. I saw that sign. I mean, the nice thing about being in the military as a writer is you don't have to invent much. I'm not that imaginative, actually.
Can I actually point out there's several women veterans who are
Yep.
writing currently? I mean, I count myself among them. But there is actually, whether it's a endemic of a greater problem within the publishing industry or not, or something else, there's several women veterans who cannot sell their manuscripts, and male manuscripts are given precedence. And so it's something to think about. It's also the VITA list comes out every year, and it shows the balance of male authors being published versus women in all genres. So that's just
And I would recommend, so Mariette's The Train in Fire and Forget is fantastic. There's also an anthology called The Road Ahead that has some just superb female veteran writers and just some great stories in there, and a very real diversity of perspective. And
So thank you again.
Thank
Please
you.
join me. And thanks to you for your excellent questions. Please be our guest upstairs for some refreshments and informal conversation.